All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. It's funny, I was just thinking earlier about how we use all these different tools for different jobs around the house. You wouldn't use a hammer to, say, tighten a screw, right?
Yeah, of course. Right tool for the job. Makes sense.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're diving into today, but with a bit more microscopic focus, we're talking antibiotics, specifically how they're categorized by their spectrum of activity, basically which bacteria they're effective against.
It's really fundamental stuff. Yeah. I mean, you've got all these different bacteria out there causing infections, and not every antibiotic works against every one of them. That's where this whole spectrum concept comes in. And luckily, we've got some excellent sources here that break down these categories and why it matters so much.
Totally. So to kick things off, let's talk about what I imagine is like the most precise tool in the toolbox, right? The narrow spectrum antibiotics.
Exactly. Think of them as specialists, really. They zero in on a very specific group of bacteria, sometimes even just a single species.
So they're not just throwing a wide net out there and hoping for the best.
Not at all. They target very specific features or mechanisms unique to those bacteria. Like, imagine you've got a lock that only a very specific key can open.
So a good example of that is isoniazid.
Yeah, isoniazid. That's a classic example. It's primarily used for tuberculosis, targeting Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It goes after a metabolic pathway that's essential for that bacterium to survive. Pretty effective.
So if you know exactly what's causing the infection, like you said, you get a lab test, the narrow spectrum option seems like the way to go, right?
Yeah.
What are the main advantages of this kind of targeted approach?
Well, for one, it minimizes collateral damage. You're not wiping out a ton of beneficial bacteria in your body, your microbiota.
Right, you want to keep those guys around.
Absolutely. And it also helps reduce the chances of other bacteria developing resistance because they're not being bombarded with the drug unnecessarily.
Makes perfect sense. So let's say you're not quite sure what's causing the infection. That's where the broader spectrum stuff comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's when you might need something broader. These are the antibiotics that can tackle a wider range of bacteria, both the gram-positive and the gram-negative kinds.
So we're talking about stuff like amoxicillin and ampicillin, tetracyclines like doxycycline, fluoroquinolones like ciprofloxacin, even some really powerful drugs like carbapenems, which imipenem and meropenem are the big ones, right?
Exactly. Those are some of the major players. And the way they work is by targeting processes that are common to many bacteria, like how they build their cell walls or how their ribosomes function, which is vital for making proteins.
So they're kind of like the multi-tools you were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And just like those multi-tools, they can be incredibly useful when you need that versatility, especially when the clock is ticking, or if there's a chance multiple types of bacteria are involved. But there's a trade-off here.
Yeah, because our sources mention this whole issue of antibiotic resistance, right?
Yeah.
It's a huge problem. And it seems like using these broad spectrum antibiotics might contribute to that.
Absolutely. That's the big concern. When you're hitting a wide range of bacteria, you're basically increasing the selection pressure for resistance to develop. You're essentially weeding out the susceptible ones and allowing the resistant ones to flourish. And that's not just bad for the individual patient, it's a public health concern. It makes it harder to treat infections in the long run for everyone.
So what's the guidance on that? I mean, is there ever a time when you'd absolutely avoid using a broad spectrum antibiotic, even if you're not sure exactly what the bug is?
Oh, yeah. There are definitely situations where you'd want to be extra cautious. Because they affect so many different bacteria, they can really disrupt the balance of the normal healthy bacteria that we rely on. That can lead to all sorts of complications, like secondary infections, things like C. difficile colitis. It's not pretty.
Yeah, it sounds rough.
So the general principle is if you can narrow it down, always try to use the most targeted antibiotic you can. That's the best way to minimize the risk of resistance developing.
That's really good to know. So where do extended spectrum antibiotics fit into all of this?
That's where things get even more, targeted. These are basically the next generation. They're often modified versions of existing antibiotics, specifically designed to work against bacteria that have become resistant to the earlier versions.
So they're kind of evolving alongside the bacteria.
Exactly. It's an arms race,
Okay.
And in our research here, we see examples like third-generation cephalosporins like ceftazidime and combinations like piperacillin tazobactam.
So how do those work? How do they manage to get around the resistance?
Well, take ceftazidime, for example. It's been tweaked to have better activity against certain gram-negative bacteria that might be resistant to older types of cephalosporins. And then you have combinations like piperacillin tazobactam, that's a broad-spectrum penicillin paired up with a beta-lactamase inhibitor.
Beta-lactamase, that's one of those enzymes that bacteria use to break down certain antibiotics, right?
Exactly. It's like a shield for the bacteria. But tazobactam, that's the inhibitor part, it basically blocks those enzymes, allowing the piperacillin to do its job. Pretty clever.
It's amazing how they come up with these things.
It is, isn't it? It's a constant back and forth.
So at the end of the day, it seems like knowing about this spectrum of activity isn't just some abstract concept, right? It has real-world implications for how we choose the right antibiotics to treat infections.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that sweet spot between effectiveness and minimizing the negative consequences. We want to knock out the bad bacteria without causing more problems down the line.
Exactly. So just to recap, we've got our narrow-spectrum antibiotics, the precise specialists. Then we've got the broad-spectrum ones for those situations where you need a wider net. And finally, the extended-spectrum antibiotics, which are designed to combat those pesky resistant bacteria.
And remembering all this, it really makes you appreciate just how complex our relationship with the microbial world is. It's not just about wiping them out. It's about understanding them, finding that balance.
Absolutely. And that leaves me thinking, for all of you listening out there, how does knowing about this spectrum of activity, this constant evolution of antibiotics, change your perspective on how we use them, how we develop new ones? It's a pretty fascinating area to think about, this whole interaction between us and these microscopic life forms.
It really is. And with that, we'll leave you to ponder that. Until next time.